Okay, let's talk about Bangladesh. You might know it for its incredible textiles, its spicy biryani, or maybe for that one time your uncle went there and wouldn't stop talking about the traffic. But in July 2024, the world's attention snapped to this nation of 170 million people for a very different reason. For 36 days, a movement that started with students fighting for a fair shot at a government job spiraled into a full-blown revolution. This period, which many are now calling 36 July, wasn't just a protest, it was a seismic shift that ended a 15-year rule and gave birth to what millions are calling a second independence. It's a story about how the frustration of the youth can topple even the most entrenched powers. So, what was the big deal? It all began with something that sounds super bureaucratic, the government job quota system. Imagine graduating from college, ready to take on the world, only to find out that a huge chunk of government jobs, some of the most stable and sought-after gigs in the country, are reserved. Not just a few, but a significant percentage were set aside for specific groups, including descendants of freedom fighters from the 1971 Liberation War. While the initial idea was noble, decades later, students argued that this system was locking them out. It had become a tool for patronage, rewarding connections over competence, and creating a bottleneck for a generation of bright, ambitious young Bangladeshis who just wanted a fair chance. This wasn't a new fight. Students had protested the quota system before, back in 2018, but this time was different. The country was simmering with a deeper discontent. Years of alleged corruption, a shrinking space for dissent, and a feeling that the political system was rigged had created a pressure cooker environment. The quota issue was just the spark that lit the fuse. What started as a campus-based movement quickly became a magnet for everyone who felt left behind. It was a simple, powerful demand: scrap the quotas and let the best person win. It was a call for meritocracy in a system that many felt had abandoned it long ago. The term 36 July is a bit of poetic license because the protests actually spilled into August. But it captures the essence of that intense month-long struggle that culminated on August 5th. It represents the 36 days of defiance, of hope, and of immense sacrifice. And the phrase, second independence? That's even more powerful. It suggests that for many, this was more than just a change in government. It was a fundamental reset, a reclaiming of the democratic ideals of the nation's original birth in 1971. It was a generation saying, "We want our country back." This wasn't just a news cycle, it was history being written in real time on the streets of Dhaka. It all kicked off on July 1, 2024. Students from universities across Bangladesh, organized under the banner of the Anti-Discrimination Student Movement, started holding peaceful demonstrations. They blocked roads, chanted slogans, and held rallies. Their message was clear and unified. They wanted the government to honor a 2018 decision to reform the quota system. At first, it looked like a standard student protest, the kind that happens all over the world. The energy was high, but the atmosphere was largely non-violent. The students were smart. They used social media to coordinate, live-streaming their marches and making sure their message of fairness and equality reached every corner of the country. They were fighting for their future, and they wanted everyone to see it. But peaceful protests have a way of making people in power nervous. And in Bangladesh, the response was swift and brutal. The ruling party's student wing, the Bangladesh Chhatra League, has a long and notorious reputation for acting as an enforcer. Instead of dialogue, the government's first response was violence. Activists, sometimes armed with sticks and metal rods, descended on the protesters. They were soon joined by the police, who used tear gas, rubber bullets, and, according to many eyewitnesses, live ammunition to disperse the crowds. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Attacking students is a red line in Bangladesh, a country that venerates its student activists for their role in the language movement and the war for independence. The violence didn't crush the movement, it supercharged it. Every video of a student being beaten, every image of a blood-soaked campus went viral. The fight was no longer just about jobs, it was now about justice, about the right to protest without being attacked by your own government. The crackdown transformed the students into martyrs and heroes. Their cause resonated with millions of ordinary citizens, Parents, shopkeepers, office workers, who were horrified by the state's brutality. People who had been silent for years, afraid to speak out against the government, now felt compelled to join. The government had turned a specific grievance into a national uprising. What followed was a rapid, organic expansion of the protests. It wasn't just in the capital, Dhaka, anymore. The anger spread like wildfire to cities and towns all across the country, from the port city of Chittagong to smaller towns like Bogara and Rangpur. The movement's leadership, a group of student coordinators, became the de facto voice of a leaderless revolution. They were young, articulate, and uncompromising. The government had hoped to intimidate a few thousand students into silence. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant and united a nation against them, turning a campus issue into a fight for the very soul of Bangladesh. As the protests swelled from thousands to millions, the government of Sheikh Hasina doubled down on its strategy of suppression. Instead of de-escalating, they declared war on their own citizens. The first major tool they deployed was the curfew. On July 19th, a nationwide indefinite curfew was imposed, ordering people to stay off the streets. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to force everyone back into their homes and break the momentum of the movement. But in the age of the internet, you can't just lock people away and expect them to be quiet. The curfew was widely defied, turning into a cat-and-mouse game between protesters and security forces in neighborhoods across the country. When the curfews failed to stop the people, the government pulled the plug on the internet. First, they slowed it down to a crawl, making it impossible to upload videos or live stream. Then, they shut it off completely. For days, Bangladesh was plunged into a digital darkness. This was a calculated move to disrupt the protesters' ability to organize and, more importantly, to prevent the world from seeing what was happening. It was an attempt to create an information black hole where violence could occur without witnesses. But this tactic also backfired. The blackout only fueled more anger and fear, confirming for many that the government had something terrible to hide. It created an environment rife with rumors and anxiety, making the situation even more volatile. On top of curfews and internet shutdowns, the government escalated its physical response. Universities, the epicenters of the protest, were declared closed indefinitely. This was meant to disperse the student leaders and send everyone home. Security forces, including the police and the elite Rapid Action Battalion, were deployed in overwhelming numbers. They set up checkpoints, raided student dormitories, and conducted mass arrests. The government narrative, pushed through state-controlled media, was that these were not students, but violent saboteurs and political agents of the opposition trying to destabilize the country. They were painting a picture of chaos that they themselves had created. The message from the top was uncompromising. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, in her public addresses, remained defiant. She blamed the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party and its allies for orchestrating the violence, refusing to acknowledge the organic student-led nature of the uprising. She offered talks, but on her own terms, without addressing the core demands for her resignation and accountability for the violence. This refusal to listen, this insistence on a narrative that contradicted what everyone was seeing with their own eyes, only hardened the resolve of the protesters. The government's iron fist wasn't crushing the rebellion, it was forging it into something stronger and more determined. One of the most chilling aspects of the 36-day protest was the uncertainty surrounding the true human cost. How many people died? The numbers are all over the place, and that's by design. With the internet shut down and a climate of fear silencing journalists and doctors, getting accurate information became nearly impossible. The government initially reported a handful of deaths, then a few dozen. But stories leaking out from hospitals and morgues told a far grislier tale. Independent sources and opposition groups began putting the number in the hundreds, with some estimates climbing as high as 1,400. This massive discrepancy isn't just a statistical issue, it's a testament to the government's effort to conceal the scale of its violent crackdown. The reason for the conflicting numbers is simple: censorship and intimidation. The government-imposed media blackout meant that news outlets couldn't report freely. Journalists faced threats, and hospitals were reportedly ordered not to release casualty figures. Families of the victims were allegedly pressured into silence, sometimes unable to even retrieve the bodies of their loved ones for a proper burial. In this vacuum of credible information, organizations inside and outside the country scrambled to piece together the truth, relying on brave citizen journalists and a network of activists who were risking their lives to document the atrocities. The official count and the people's count told two completely different stories about the same events. Beyond the dead, there were the arrested. The government confirmed making over 11,000 arrests. Think about that number. 11,000 people, mostly students, young professionals, and activists, were rounded up and thrown into overcrowded jails. Many were arrested during nighttime raids on their homes, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Student leaders like Nahid Islam and Abu Sayed were taken into custody, becoming symbols of the thousands who were disappeared into the state's security apparatus. These mass arrests were a tactic of collective punishment, designed to terrorize the population and decapitate the movement by removing its most vocal and organized members. The toll wasn't just physical. The violence left deep psychological scars on the nation. The government's own security forces also suffered casualties, with reports of at least 44 policemen killed in the clashes, a fact the Awami League highlighted to frame the protesters as violent aggressors. But for the general public, the enduring image was of their own government turning its guns on unarmed youth. This created a profound sense of betrayal. The state, which is supposed to protect its citizens, had become their primary antagonist. The fight for jobs had morphed into a struggle for survival, and the true cost, measured in lives lost, families broken, and trust shattered, may never be fully known. The Awami League government, led by Sheikh Hasina, saw the protests through a very specific political lens. To them, this was not a spontaneous uprising of disgruntled students. From their perspective, it was, a conspiracy orchestrated by their long-time political rivals, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party and its Islamist allies, Jamaat-e-Islami. Government ministers and party officials repeatedly claimed that saboteurs had infiltrated the student movement to create chaos and overthrow a democratically elected government. They pointed to instances of vandalism against public property and attacks on police as proof that this was not a peaceful movement, but a violent insurrection aimed at destabilizing the country for political gain. This narrative was blasted across state-run television and pro-government newspapers. The Awami League argued that they were the guardians of the secular, progressive values born from the 1971 Liberation War, and that the forces they were fighting were reactionaries trying to drag the country backward. They reminded the public of the economic growth and development projects achieved under Sheikh Hasina's tenure. In their view, they had brought stability and prosperity, and these protests were an ungrateful and dangerous challenge to that progress. They believed that a firm hand was necessary to restore order and protect the state from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. However, this official explanation failed to convince a huge portion of the population. For millions of ordinary Bangladeshis, this was not about party politics. Many of the protesters were too young to have strong allegiances to either the Awami League or the BNP. Their anger was rooted in their lived experiences. They saw a government that had been in power for 15 years, a period marked by accusations of rampant corruption, cronyism, and the erosion of democratic institutions. They had witnessed elections that were widely seen as flawed, a crackdown on free speech, and the rise of a political elite that seemed untouchable and unaccountable. The quota issue was simply the final straw. The reason so many people poured into the streets was that the students' fight for fairness resonated with their own frustrations. It was the small business owner tired of paying bribes, the parent worried about their child's future, and the activist who had been silenced for years. They saw the government's violent response not as a necessary measure to restore order, but as confirmation of its authoritarian nature. The BCL's thuggery and the police's brutality were not new. They were tactics that people had seen used to crush dissent for years. This time, the scale was just too large to ignore. The movement became a unifying force for everyone who felt that the system was no longer working for them, but for a select few. Amidst the escalating chaos, there was a moment when it seemed like a legal solution might calm the storm. On July 21, 2024, Bangladesh's Supreme Court weighed in on the quota issue. The court delivered a ruling that partially addressed the students' demands, ordering a reduction in the controversial quota system. In normal times, this might have been seen as a victory, a reasonable compromise that could have taken the wind out of the protesters' sails. The government certainly hoped it would. They presented the ruling as a solution, urging students to accept the court's decision and return to their classes. It was their off-ramp, their chance to say, "We listened, the system works, now go home." But it was too little, too late. The movement had moved far beyond the initial issue of job quotas. The core grievances were now the brutal crackdown, the hundreds of alleged killings, and the mass arrests of student leaders. The protesters felt that accepting the court's ruling would be a betrayal of those who had been killed and imprisoned. Their demands had evolved. They now wanted the immediate and unconditional release of all arrested protesters, the lifting of the curfew, the reopening of universities, and most importantly, accountability for the violence. The slogan on the streets was no longer just about reform, it was about retribution and justice. The government's refusal to concede on these new demands pushed the country towards a breaking point. The student coordinators announced a nationwide non-cooperation movement, a strategy famously used during the subcontinent's struggles against colonial rule. They called for a complete shutdown of the country. People were urged to stop going to work, to stop paying taxes, and to bring the entire machinery of the state to a grinding halt. This was a massive escalation. It was no longer just a protest, it was a direct challenge to the government's authority to govern. The call for non-cooperation was incredibly effective, paralyzing transportation, businesses, and government offices. This set the stage for the final dramatic days. On August 4th and 5th, the non-cooperation movement reached its zenith. Millions of people defied the curfew and flooded the streets of Dhaka and other cities in what was called the Final March. The security forces, which had seemed so formidable just days before, appeared to melt away in the face of the sheer number of people. Protesters began to take over government buildings, police stations, and the offices of the state broadcaster. The authority of the state had completely collapsed. It became clear that Sheikh Hasina had lost control of the country. The tipping point had been crossed, and her historic 15-year rule was about to come to a spectacular and sudden end. August 5th, 2024, is a date that will be etched into the memory of every Bangladeshi. On that day, the unthinkable happened. As millions of protesters converged on the capital, effectively seizing control of the city, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's grip on power evaporated. The situation had become completely untenable, with the civil administration paralyzed and reports that the army was unwilling to intervene against the people. She was left with no other option. In a stunning turn of events, Sheikh Hasina resigned from her post and, along with her sister, fled the country by helicopter, seeking refuge in neighboring India. The departure was abrupt and dramatic, marking the end of an era in Bangladeshi politics. The news of her resignation sent waves of jubilation across the nation. People poured into the streets not in protest, but in celebration. Strangers hugged each other. Fireworks lit up the night sky, and chants of victory echoed through the cities. For the protesters, this was the ultimate validation of their struggle and sacrifice. After 36 days of fear, violence, and uncertainty, they had achieved their ultimate goal. The fall of a leader who had dominated the political landscape for a decade and a half felt surreal. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated catharsis. A collective sigh of relief from a nation that had been holding its breath. With a power vacuum at the top, the country needed a leader to guide it through the transition. The student coordinators, who had successfully steered the revolution, proposed a name that carried immense international prestige and a reputation for being above the country's toxic political fray: Muhammad Yunus. A Nobel Peace Prize laureate famous for his pioneering work in microfinance with Grameen Bank, Yunus was seen as a neutral and respected figure. On August 8th, He was sworn in as the chief advisor of an interim government, tasked with the monumental job of healing the nation, carrying out essential reforms, and paving the way for free and fair elections. Yunus's appointment was met with widespread approval, both at home and abroad. He immediately struck a conciliatory tone, promising to build a government of consensus and to listen to the voices of the young people who had brought about this change. He reassured the international community, particularly on critical issues like the garment industry and support for Rohingya refugees, signaling stability. His first speeches were filled with promises of a new beginning, a Bangladesh free from corruption and political oppression. The man once called the banker to the poor was now tasked with rebuilding the foundations of a nation's democracy. In the aftermath of the revolution, the new interim government faced the colossal task of dismantling the old system and addressing the wounds of the past 36 days. One of the first orders of business was to seek justice. Multiple legal cases were swiftly filed against former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and key members of her cabinet and security apparatus. The charges were severe, including mass murder, crimes against humanity, and orchestrating the violent crackdown on protesters. The country's War Crimes Tribunal, originally formed to prosecute collaborators from the 1971 war, announced it would investigate Hasina, a move heavy with historical irony. The call for accountability was deafening, and the new government was under immense pressure to deliver it. Simultaneously, the nation began the slow process of returning to a semblance of normalcy. On August 19th, schools and universities, which had been shut down for weeks, finally reopened their doors. The sight of students returning to their campuses, this time not to protest but to learn, was a powerful symbol of a new chapter. In another significant move, the bank accounts of Khaleda Zia, the former Prime Minister and Hasina's longtime political rival who had been under house arrest, were unfrozen on August 20th. These actions were seen as crucial steps toward undoing the political polarization and persecution that had defined the previous decade and a half. The spirit of the revolution was also immortalized on the streets of Dhaka. The city's walls, once covered in political posters, became a canvas for a generation of artists. Graffiti and murals celebrating the Second Independence appeared overnight. These artworks depicted scenes from the protests, students standing defiant against police, portraits of fallen martyrs, and slogans of freedom and hope. These murals served as a living monument to the struggle, a constant reminder to the public and the new government of the sacrifices made and the promises that needed to be kept. They transformed the urban landscape into a gallery of the people's victory. However, the transition was not without its dark spots. In the chaotic days following Hasina's departure, there were disturbing reports of targeted attacks against the Hindu minority community and their properties. These acts of communal violence were a grim reminder of the deep-seated tensions that can surface during times of upheaval. In response, minority rights groups demanded the formation of a special commission to investigate the attacks and protect vulnerable communities. The interim government, under Muhammad Yunus, now faced the challenge of not only building a new democracy, but also ensuring that it would be an inclusive one for all its citizens. I don't think people understand just how close Bangladesh came to rewriting its own destiny. For 36 days, millions took to the streets, risking everything to challenge a system many believed was unbreakable. What started as a protest became a movement, one that shattered decades of fear and silence, and forced the powerful to listen. Fueled by social media and a new generation unwilling to accept the status quo, Bangladeshis demanded real change, no matter the cost. Some called it a second independence, echoing the spirit of 1971. But this time, the enemy was within. Corruption, authoritarianism, and broken promises were on trial, and the people refused to back down. The world watched as a new chapter was written, one where the youth led and the nation found its voice. The stakes? The very future of Bangladesh, its democracy, its freedom, and its soul. This is the story of how a nation stood up and why nothing will ever be the same again. In the heart of South Asia, a storm was brewing. For 36 days, the streets of Bangladesh shook with the footsteps of millions, students, workers, and ordinary citizens, united by a single, burning question: who owns the future? This is not just a story of protest, it's the story of a nation at a crossroads, where the dreams of a new generation collided with decades of broken promises, where hope was met with bullets and silence was shattered by the roar of a revolution. As the government clung to power, young Bangladeshis risked everything, facing curfews, blackouts and violence, to demand a fair shot at life. A fight that began over jobs became a battle for the very soul of the country. Behind every headline was a personal sacrifice. Behind every chant, a cry for justice. This was more than politics. It was a reckoning with the past and a fight to reclaim the future. The world watched as Bangladesh teetered on the edge, between fear and freedom, oppression and hope. What happened in those 36 days would not just topple a regime, it would redefine what it means to be Bangladeshi. This is the untold story of courage, of heartbreak, and of a second independence. Welcome to 36 July, the revolution you weren't supposed to see, but will never forget.